Good morning, YouTube. I got up really early because of you today. Well, actually, because of me, because I was the one to come up with this idea of reading more books and blogging about it. And it's a really rainy day. I don't know if you can hear the rain. But I thought rain days are just perfect for books, aren't they? So my YouTube channel is new, and I guess I owe you some sort of introduction. And I've tried like the tag list, the best books of 2011, and it just did not quite work for me. So I just picked out some books that I read last year, and I'm just going to show them to you for you to get an impression of what I read and what you can expect from this channel. So let's go. One theme for me last year was trying to read more classics, and one of those authors that I wanted to read was Fyodor Dostoevsky. Here you have Poor Folk, which I picked up first before reading Crime and Punishment because I was actually quite intimidated by his style. I was imagining it to be quite difficult to read, quite antiquated, and so I picked up the smaller book first to get used to it, and I was really surprised because it's probably the translation, but this was pretty easy to read and actually quite an interesting story. And I was really ready to move on to Crime and Punishment when this book mentioned Pushkin, which I just so happened to have a volume of short stories by, so I got distracted by that. I got halfway through the book and then I got distracted by something else, and I never actually read Crime and Punishment. Which is on my to-be-read pile for this year, which, again, my to-be-read pile is huge. One of the books I enjoyed most last year was this here. Awesome, huge luxury edition of Rumo's Adventures in Demonia, I think it's called in English. This is the German copy. I guess you're probably not familiar with Walter Mörs. He's a German fantasy author, and I dare compare him with Terry Pratchett because he's really, he writes very humorous books, kind of like a very good read generally, without being flat, and the stories always do have some depth to it. Just to show you this one, as you might have seen from the Dostoevsky book, I like used books. Whenever I get a chance, which at the moment I don't get very often, I go into used bookstores, and often it's because I'm already looking for a list of 20 or more books that would cost me a fortune in a normal bookstore, or I just go there to browse, which I did on this occasion when I picked up The Butterfly Revolution by William Butler. I actually picked it up because of the cover, which I know it's jaded, but I just thought it's really pretty. And this book was really interesting because I would describe it as like a mix of The Animal Farm and The Lord of the Flies, only, if not more contemporary, closer to home, because it takes place in a summer camp. And that's just an example of like the books that I randomly pick up in used bookstores. A book that I've specifically been hunting for is Joey Goebbels' Vincent, or in English it's called Torture the Artist. He's an American author, but not very often to be found in America actually. He's much more popular over here in Europe, which is why I picked up a German copy, because the English copy is really hard to get a hold of, and I usually read originals when I can, but this translation is actually okay. Yeah, Joey Goebbels is probably one of my favorite authors. He just writes very weird characters, whereas the story is usually in a very normal setting. Definitely a book to check out. Something else that I love is fantasy, and I've noticed that I haven't read a lot of fantasy in recent years, so I started to pick back up on it. And some more fantasy, I'm really into the Dragonlance series, and especially when you go to used bookstores, it's really difficult to find a trilogy or an even longer series that is complete. Like you end up finding part 2 and part 5. So I was so thrilled when I found this here, the Legends trilogy from Dragonlance. I had to buy it. I read it in a very short time. I mean, this is the kind of fantasy that I like to read in between more serious books. Which is not to say, I mean, obviously, if the stories were totally boring, I wouldn't do that. They do still have some philosophy to them. I mean, you know, the whole battle between good and evil, and just generally things that are bigger than our minds. But that's maybe 10% of it, and 90% is entertainment, which I think is good in between some more difficult reads. Like this one, for example. This is Satan in the Suburbs and Other Short Stories by Bertrand Russell. Now, Bertrand Russell isn't really your typical author. He was a mathematician and professor of philosophy, I think. And you can really see that in his writing. And then again, the book is from the 40s, so obviously it reads differently than something contemporary. But you can definitely see that he's trying to put a lot of thought into it, which makes it a really interesting read. But it's not necessarily like a straightforward storyline. Nonetheless, this is, again, one of the interesting reads you can pick up in used bookstores. Probably one of the greatest things to pick up this past year, and with things I mean favorite series and favorite book totally out of my comfort zone, because I'm usually not much into comics or graphic novels, but when I walked into a comic store looking for something completely different, and I got hooked on Sandman, that was probably one of the best things to happen to me last year. This is just something to hold into the camera. It's part 3 and 4 of the Sandman series. Part 1 and 2 I don't currently have, and unfortunately I have nothing past part 4, which I hope to change this year. I was not aware that there was this whole realm of graphic novels beyond, you know, your stereotypical superhero. So the Sandman just amazes me. Moving on to the last book that I read last year. I actually wanted to make it the first book of this year, but I just could not wait. And that is The Asylum for Wayward Victorian Girls by Emily Autumn. I just love this book so much. I mean, it was definitely my most anticipated book of last year. It's probably a book you've never heard of before, because it's actually very difficult to get. The only place you can get it is Emily Autumn's web store, because it's not sold in any normal bookstores. It's quite expensive too, which is why it's taken me so long to get it. But definitely a great read. Obviously more for Emily Autumn fans, especially with it being so difficult to get your hands on the book. But I would definitely recommend it for anybody that's interested in psychology, and just a pretty thrilling story. And I mean, it's beautiful. It's got all these annotations and stuff copied into it, and it's got whole pages that are handwritten, and every page is like designed like this nicely, and it's got artwork, and it's got photographs, and it's just so beautiful. Definitely going to be a book that I reread this year at some point. Now, to my plans for this year for this channel, I have mentioned that I've not read as much fantasy as I would like to, so that's definitely going to be a theme this year, especially rereading some of the fantasy series that I have enjoyed in the past. So I'm planning on rereading all of Harry Potter, I'm planning on reading The Hobbit, and then rereading The Lord of the Rings, and get my hands on more Terry Pratchett books, and obviously read more of The Sandman. But don't worry, fantasy is not going to be the only thing on this channel, so if you're not into that, subscribe anyway, because I'm going to have other books. I do have to warn you though about contemporary books. I don't have a lot of them, I don't buy a lot of them, simply because I already have a huge to-be-read pile of classics and just books that have come out a couple of years past, that have been out for a while. So I just can't spend a lot of time with contemporary books because I already have so much to read. But I mean, you know the feeling of having like a huge to-be-read pile, and you never really get around to reading all of it. So I think that is all for my introduction. I hope you saw some interesting books. I hope they got you interested enough to subscribe, and I'm gonna have a review of either the Wayward Victorian Girls Asylum or Joey Goebbels up quite soon. So do stay tuned, do subscribe, and I'll see you on the next page.